Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us for today's presentation on epiphytes, life in the treetops. My name is James Stevenson, and I'm coming to you from the University of Florida Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences, the Extension Services right here in Pinellas County. Our offices are at Brooker Creek Preserve. If you haven't visited Brooker Creek Preserve, do take some time out this summer. We do open at 7 a.m., an excellent time to come and see. The light is lovely first thing in the morning. The wildlife is usually out and about. And of course, it's much nicer to visit places in the outdoors in July, August, and September earlier in the day. As a part of the Extension Services, we provide research-based information for free to the citizens in our county to help make informed choices about their activities around the places where they have influence, around the home, around the church, around the school, these kinds of places, wherever you interact with your environment. We give you information on, we help you make decisions about things that have to do with the natural resource conservation. If you have any problems with today's presentation, any concerns, questions, or complaints, please don't hesitate to contact me. First initial, last name. So it's James with a J, Stevenson with a V, at pinellascounty.org. I'm at your service to answer questions beyond today's presentation about matters that have to do with natural resource conservation. To keep update with what happens up here at Brooker, look for our Brooker Creek Preserve Environmental Education Center presence on Facebook. So that's it about Brooker and Extension and me. We'll go ahead and crash on, trying to keep to time and discuss this fascinating group of plants, the epiphytes. Now, epi, like your epidermis, means on, top of, and phyte means plants. So these are organisms, mostly plants, that live on other plants, but it does not mean parasite. That's a different lifestyle. Parasitism is a different lifestyle. Epiphytes do not take part in a parasitic lifestyle. They have a completely different reason for living on plants. Epiphytes, as a group of non-related organisms, they do no harm. Epiphytes do no harm. They're not parasitic. I like to say they have no interest in harming their host, because if an epiphytic plant were to harm whatever the tree or whatever they're growing on, that tree would eventually come crashing to the ground, and that would be the end of the epiphyte. So epiphytic organisms, and what we'll look at mostly today are epiphytic plants, they do zero harm and they are zero parasites. This is a photograph of some of the species that we're going to be looking at today, all growing quite happily together on a metal fence that's coated in plastic. Very hard to parasitize plastic and metal. Do you see where I'm going with this? These organisms do not derive any nutrient whatsoever. They take no resources away from whatever they're growing on. It's a lifestyle. It's a way to be. Here we have kind of common in damp woods, flooded forests like we have up here at Brooker Creek. This would be a live oak, and its branches are covered in epiphytes, plants that are adapted to living on other plants. And in this case, that other plant is a live oak. Epiphytism is a response to a limited space. So if you think about a walk in the woods, there's just plants everywhere. And if you're underneath a great big giant tree, the soil is going to be full of that tree's roots. And if you're a plant that's trying to grow, it would be very hard as a small plant to compete with the roots of that giant tree for any water in the soil. The tree's going to get to it first, and you're going to suffer. So it's very crowded out in the woods, and these plants have solved that problem by adapting ways of taking root up off the ground, up in the branches of these trees, and holding on and getting all their needs met. They're closer to the sun. They're out of competition, and they have plenty of their own space. Again, if a little plant was trying to grow underneath this oak tree, it would be in competition with the oak tree for the light. The leaves of the oak tree would be filtering all the sunlight before it even hit the forest floor. An adaptation that gets plants up through to the tops of the branches is going to get those plants closer up to the sun and more access to light. Competing with other plant roots in the ground can be very tricky. The competition is very high. Water, just like light and space, can be a limiting factor for success. Epiphytic plants have solved this problem by adapting their whole bodies to take in water in new ways that benefit the plants and allow for the roots of many of these plants to have a different function, and that function is just hanging on. So we'll have a look at how some of these plants do that in just a bit. Here's just a photograph of some very happy sea urchins. No, this is an epiphyte. This is a bromeliad, using its roots to hang on tight to the bark of a maple tree. It's not parasitizing the maple tree. I'm going to say this probably 7,000 times until you believe me. Not parasitizing the maple tree, just using the roots to hang on. Not harm the maple tree, because if the maple tree fails, the epiphytes will fail. This is southern needleleaf, and in the wintertime, it's not protected from the UV light of the sun because the maple has lost all of its leaves. So it's exposed to a lot more UV light, and its needles, its needle-like leaves, have turned bright red as a form of sunscreen. Another epiphytic group of plants that we'll look at first are the orchids. Orchids are very, very, very specialized flowering plants. They're related to each other. Orchids form a nice family of flowering plants, and you probably recognize an orchid if you were shown one. We'll actually take a look at all the native orchids that live here in Pinellas County in a few weeks' time. But as a group of plants, many have adopted this epiphytic lifestyle because they're otherwise very specialized to succeed. Living as an epiphyte has proven to be extremely successful for this group of flowering plants, the orchids. As too, it has been very successful for another family of flowering plants, the Bromeliads. And the majority of this family of plants live with an epiphytic lifestyle, living on other plants. More often than not, epiphytes live on trees because trees tend to be the longest living, the most, they're in existence for the longest amount of time of all your choices of things to live on. what am I trying to say? If you are adapted to be an epiphyte, you're going to want to live on something that's going to be around for a long time. And of all your choices in the forest, trees are the things that are going to be around the longest. If your seed germinates on, let's say, a ragweed plant, your seed germinates and starts to grow and gets real excited about growing. At the end of that year, the ragweed plant naturally dies away, and that's the end of it. The tree, of course, is going to live from year to year to year to year to year, and so just by default, trees tend to bear the highest load of plants with an epiphytic lifestyle. We'll take a look at a couple of fern species that have adapted the epiphytic lifestyle as well. And we'll finish up, we're going to get really, really granular and kind of obscure, and we'll take a look at some other organisms who also have the ability to take advantage of these long-lasting surfaces, aka tree bark, allowing more access to the resources that plants need to survive, water and sunlight. Okay, that's what we're going to do. And I see that we've got about 20 people with us today. I'm really glad you're here on a hot Wednesday afternoon. I hope that I can retain your attention through that subject matter. Let's start by looking at the orchids, our native orchids that have adapted an epiphytic lifestyle. We only have a few. Interestingly, despite the fact that orchids as a whole are primarily epiphytic, here in Pinellas County, we have a majority of orchid species that are actually terrestrial. They've actually adapted to living in the ground. But the epiphytic species that we have include the Florida butterfly orchid. There are still a few of these plants in flower at Brooker Creek. Looking up into the tree branches, this is actually one of our tree branches right here in Brooker Creek. Throughout the month of June and obviously into July, the flowers are produced on these long, thin flowering stalks. Flowers are about 2 inches across, 4 centimeters across. Very fragrant. The Tampa butterfly orchid or the Florida butterfly orchid. This is about its northernmost range. It's actually called Encyclia tampensis. It's named after our very own Tampa, Florida. And the encyclia bit, in the inside of the flower, the petals are kind of arranged in a circle. So they encircle the very central bit to fit the face of their preferred pollinator, a small native bee. Encyclia tampensis, this is an interesting yet typical for orchids. It has the modified petal that acts kind of like a landing pad. And here you can see that landing pad petal has a nice purple splotch in the middle. This plant does everything it can to ensure that the pollinator knows exactly where to go to get the nectar reward. And in exchange, it's going to pick up the pollen to transfer to another Encyclia tampensis to fertilize and eventually develop the seed pods, which when mature are dry and they split into they split along 6 seams and release seeds that are like dust. Orchids have very, very, very specialized, extremely highly specialized seeds, almost too specialized, where they can get millions of seeds in a single seed pod because they're so small. They're almost like spores. They're so small, but they can drift in the air, you see, being so small, and they can land in crevices in tree branches, see, and then germinate and grow and establish their life in the treetops. None of these species can start life on the ground and end up in the treetops. They're like all the other plants. Once they germinate, they're stuck where they've germinated. And so in order to establish in treetops, they need to germinate in treetops. And so the seeds need to be able to fly. in order to get from one location to another, far away from the original parent plant. Another one of our epiphytic orchid species, the one that we have behind us here, the needle root air plant orchid, kind of a mouthful of a common name. Locally here at Brooker, we call these plants ghost orchids. They are in the same genus as the ghost orchid that gets a lot of attention, which is also flowering this time of year, mostly down in the Fakahachi swamp area, the Fakahachi Strand. This is an orchid that doesn't produce leaves. It doesn't produce leaves, and yet it still has an epiphytic lifestyle because it has its modified roots, the roots that are modified to hang on, not in, but on to tree bark. And you can see in this photograph, the flowers are absolutely vanishingly small. They're probably gnat pollinated. Gnats, yes, gnat or mosquito pollinated. Mosquitoes can be actually quite effective pollinators. Here we have the tiny little flowers and then these huge outsized seed pods compared to the size of the flower. And again, these have split open and they're beginning to release their dust-like seeds. Here's the very first of the ghost orchids that we as a staff here at Brooker Creek encountered actually in the wild. Very exciting find, and to prove that we had seen it, your presenter actually stood behind the tree that this plant was growing on, and so that's why you have the creepy creeper in the background. But you can see how this thing grows. It uses its roots to hang on to the outside of the tree on the bark. It actually does all of its photosynthesis through its roots. Its specialized roots contain chlorophyll that photosynthesize and provide all the sugar and starch that the plant needs, even though the plant is just a bunch of roots and then occasionally flowers. Those roots have the chlorophyll to do the photosynthesis to provide the starches and sugars to reproduce the plant. The outside of epiphytic orchid roots, not just the ghost orchid, but most epiphytic orchids, are covered in a specialized layer of cells that's called the velamen. Same root as velvet. So whatever kind of texture you want to describe velvet as, this has it. Very, very increased surface area due to the texture of the velamen. The velamen is also slightly translucent, so the sun can get to those inner tissues where the chlorophyll is. And the velamen, having that high surface area because of the texture, is also able to act like a sponge and not only absorb rainwater as it strikes, but retain that, hold on to it, and hand a few water molecules at a time over to the chlorophyll so that it can go through the process of turning water into carbohydrate sugars. Once it flowers, the fruit is produced, and again, as we said before, an outsized fruit. You can see the little seams where they're going to split open and release those dust-like seeds. And as far as epiphytic orchids, that's it. Of this hugely diverse group of flowering plants, the orchids, this family of flowering plants called orchids, there's more orchids than pretty much any other group of flowering plants. They're so specialized. Most are epiphytic, but like I said, most of our species here in Pinellas County are terrestrial. So now you've met all the epiphytic orchids that are native to Pinellas County. We'll look at the terrestrials when we cover orchids in general in a few weeks' time. So we'll move on to the bromeliads, and perhaps you've heard of bromeliads. They're a popular landscape plant, the bromeliads are. they tend to grow and reproduce rather quickly, and so they're very often passed along. If a neighbor has a few bromeliads, in a few years' time, they're going to have tons, and they're going to be quite happy to share. They break apart very easily. They don't have much in the way of roots, so you can stick them anywhere and they'll start to grow. So you kind of get the bromeliads as a group, the air plants, they're often called. The most popular bromeliad is probably the pineapple, because arguably the most economically important bromeliad would be the pineapple, because it can be grown as a crop and purchased and eaten and enjoyed. But bromeliads are also incredibly economically important because they're such popular, not only landscape plants here in Florida, but house plants all around the world. The most popular, the most widely grown house plant is, in fact, a type of bromeliad. So a lot of diversity, very widely cultivated, but they're native to the New World. So their center of adaptation, their center of evolution, where bromeliads began, is somewhere in Central South America. Central South America. Of course, these used to be two different places, so I'm not quite sure, not being a bromeliad expert, if that center of origin was more Central or more South America. What matters is here we have today's distribution of wild bromeliad species. And what's interesting is there's this little breadth of bromeliad distribution in Africa, and it's just one species. And it's believed that, and there's very good reason to believe that, when these two continents, South America and Africa, when this part of South America was actually fit into this part of Africa, when the continents were much closer together, the Atlantic might have been just a river, and even a river that's a mile wide. The seeds of this species were able to cross that river and germinate and take hold, and were carried along with the continent as it drifted ever eastward into the state where it currently occupies. So the majority of bromeliads in the New World, but we do have this one disjunct population over in Africa. Having evolved in Central and South America, they've evolved very closely with hummingbirds. And so bromeliad flowers are very often long and tubular and full of nectar, as would reward a hummingbird, which evolved in the same place of South America. In Pinellas County, and especially here in Brooker Creek, we have about 8 species of bromeliad. They're all in the same genus. They're all related to each other. Of course, they look different because they're different species. And they're all in the genus Tillandsia. And you'll recognize these as we go through. You might not recognize them as bromeliads, but that's what today is for. The first one we'll look at is Spanish moss. Spanish moss is an epiphytic flowering plant, an epiphytic bromeliad. It's Tillandsia, the genus Tillandsia, usneoides, which means looks like a beard. Of course, it's referred to as Spanish moss, but it's not either. It is a native Central and North American flowering plant called Tillandsia usneoides. It's a flowering plant. You don't think about it flowering because the flowers are vanishingly small. Here we have a zoom in on what's left of this highly specialized bromeliad, the Spanish moss. It's 3 leaves, 3 long skinny leaves. Here's 1, here's 2, here's 3 skinny leaves, and then a little single flower pops out, and it's green, easily overlooked, probably moth pollinated. They're very, very fragrant, and moths are very good at picking up chemical signals, fragrance out of the air. Once this flower is pollinated, the seed capsule develops, and here we have a ripened seed capsule that's hard and dry. It doesn't make a juicy fruit. It's this hard, dry seed capsule that splits open. And when the seed capsule splits open on the Spanish moss, you can see the sides peeling back here. You can see the little torpedo-shaped seeds, and each seed is attached to this plume of hairs that act like a parachute, that are going to take the seed through the air, where it will land, hopefully, fingers crossed, or leaves crossed, land to the branches of another tree, germinate and grow into another clump of Spanish moss. Spanish moss is not a parasitic organism. Spanish moss is an epiphytic flowering plant. Spanish moss will not, cannot hurt whatever it's growing in, on, or around. Its life depends on the success of whatever it's growing on or in. If a tree is in trouble, if a tree is dying from something else, a disease or some change in the soil composition, some insult to the roots, say somebody put a parking lot on top of its root system, that could cause the tree to decline and to stop growing very vigorously. The decline in the tree growth isn't going to affect the Spanish moss. The Spanish moss is going to grow at its natural pace. And it might look like the Spanish moss is suddenly smothering the tree that it was growing on, but it's not harming that tree. There's something already wrong with the tree. I hope that's something that you can understand and internalize and believe, because that's the truth. If you need any help with that, I know there's some very maybe well-meaning professionals who tell you that the Spanish moss is killing your tree, and for a fee, they'll do you the great favor of taking it out of your tree. You're looking at the wrong problem in that situation. Also, ball moss. It's a different species. It's also Tillandsia, but it has a different growth habit. Whereas Spanish moss tends to grow in drapes, the ball moss grows in these compact spherical clusters. But you can see the similarities between the two. They have those grayish needle-like leaves. The flowers on the ball moss aren't produced all along the strands like the Spanish moss are, but rather they're produced on these long flower stalks where the pollinators can get to them without having to mess around in all this down in here. So the ball moss is another species of Tillandsia, also not parasitic, dependent on the health of the tree that they're growing in. Now, the Spanish moss, the ball moss, and several other species, they have these gray needle-like leaves. The leaves are very long and narrow, so they don't lose much water. You imagine a big, flat, floppy green leaf. That's going to evaporate an awful lot of moisture. And, you know, water, remember, is a limiting factor up there in the treetops. So the leaves are reduced to these needle-like structures, and they're covered in scales, natural outgrowths of the leaf. These scales, they add surface area to the leaves themselves, and they act like that sponge. Remember the velamen, the modified roots of the ghost orchid and the other epiphytic orchids? They have this fuzz. They're velvety, so they can absorb and retain quite a lot of rainfall. And some of these species of Tillandsia can even pull humidity out of the air. So extremely efficient at grabbing whatever water is available, being that limiting factor when you live up in the tree. Now, we saw this photograph earlier of happy epiphytes. This is southern needle leaf. Again, the leaves are reduced to these very narrow, thin, needle-like, so they don't lose this precious commodity, water. They're using their roots here to hang on tight to the tree branch, but doing the tree no harm. Another relative, these are all related, that they're all Tillandsia. We have the southern needleleaf in the upper left hand. You can see it's turned that red color in the winter time because it's being exposed to a lot of extra sunlight. The leaves of the tree that it's growing on have left, and so now it's exposed. Growing next to it here, another one of our very common air plants or epiphytes is the Florida air plant, Tillandsia simulata. And it has that funny Latin name because it's very similar to another species, easily confused with another species. But you see, the Florida air plant still has the silvery leaves. That is the suggestion that it's covered in those scales that increase the surface area. But the leaves are also very tightly bunched at the base. You see there, where you can see they're all arising from a heart or a central growing point. They're beginning to show signs of the ability to actually hold water down in these leaf bases, like a lot of the larger bromeliads can do. Another adaptation to life where water is a limiting resource. One adaptation, of course, being the scaly leaf surfaces to grab humidity and rainwater and hang on to it. Another to actually hold on to it in a cistern. Adaptation that the bromeliads have kind of come up with. The name simulata means that it looks like something else. We'll take a look at the one that it's supposed to look like in just a bit. It's the only one of these Tillandsias that we're looking at, Spanish moss, ball moss, southern needleleaf, and the ones that we'll look at going forward, that is only found in Florida. These other species are found throughout the Caribbean, Central and South America. So this is our own very special, unique to Florida, Cilantria Bromeliad. And again, you can see how they evolved with the hummingbirds, the flowers of Tillandsia simulata being tubular, the petals forming this tube shape. This is just the flower bud emerging here, nice and brightly colored. Here it is fully open. The flower is fully open here, and the petals are kind of pursed together into this tube-shaped structure, with the nectar reward being down here in the base. And anything that wants that nectar reward is going to have to stick something way down in there to get it, be it a long beak, or in the case of our butterflies, right, a long tongue structure called a proboscis, also present in a mini moth species, that proboscis that can drink nectar. But whatever's trying to go for this nectar is going to get a forehead full of pollen. And that pollen is going to be transferred to the next Tillandsia flower when the forehead comes into contact with the next flower. So you see how that works. And just like the Spanish moss, when these other species flowers are pollinated, a seed pod is formed, a dry seed pod is formed that splits open and releases the seeds on these little tufts of these little hairs. They're technically, botanically referred to as hairs, cellulosic fibers that are going to carry the seeds and hopefully get them lodged in the branches of another tree where they can start to grow. So those are the species that you're going to see the most of. Most of us have Spanish moss, ball moss already growing on the power lines. Obviously not parasitizing the power lines, right? Sometimes on fences, you'll find it growing, but certainly in trees. Spanish moss, ball moss, very adapted to living in urban situations. Some of these other species need to live up in the swamp where the air is a little bit better, because they do depend on so much of atmospheric moisture to be happy and healthy. If there's any amount of pollution, that could temper the growth of some of these other species. Another thing tempering the growth of other species. And the bad news is we have an imported Mexican bromeliad weevil. Metamasius is its name, and it came in on ornamental bromeliads, either cultivated or wild collected. Anyway, it was brought from its native Central America through the bromeliad trade, and now it has got loose and it's preying on our native species. Now, the weevil itself, weevils are a type of beetle, so they have this armored, their forewings, their front wings are modified into this protective kind of shell, and they use their hind wings to fly with. But of the beetles, the weevils have this long downturned, who's the Muppet? Gonzo, with the downturned nose, very similar to a weevil here. And they do eat bromeliad leaves, but the real damage comes from their larvae. They lay their eggs in that cistern, that the leaf bases that hold the rainwater. They lay their eggs, the eggs hatch, and the eggs, the larvae of this weevil, the grubs, they will completely hollow out that cistern area. And it's the only growing point. It's the only center of origin for new leaves and flowers. And so once that heart is gone, the entire plant falls apart. It's a relatively recent introduction, this pest. So we don't really know much about it. This weevil, I mean, we know what it is, we know how it reproduces and so on, but we don't have a really good grasp on its entire life cycle. We do know of a biological control of this beetle, and you might have heard of the success of other biological controls. For example, the air potato beetle that only eats air potato leaves, and releasing this air potato beetle, you can actually have a measurable impact on an invasive plant. You can actually see the results and see the success and measure the success. With the bromeliad weevil, the biological control agent is very fragile, doesn't transport very easily. It doesn't like to ride in the car, basically. It likes cooler weather, which could be problematic car populations here, especially on days like this. And this fragile little, car sick biological control agent is also a mosquito. So it might be a hard sell to try and say, we're going to release a new species of mosquito, okay? So problematic on many levels, finding a control. The species that are susceptible to this weevil include the northern needleleaf, which is a very interesting of these air plants, of these tillandsias. You can see it has a very well-developed cistern. So it has a lot of area for that weevil larva to get in and tear apart. Easily identified for the presence of that very rounded cistern, and also of the curlicue nature of the leaves. It has the most reflexed or the most curly leaves of any of our tillandsias. You can often see these flowering in the winter. So not only are the flowers brightly colored, but the stems that produce the flowers are also brightly colored. So they're going to attract the pollinators if those pollinators have the eyesight honed in to pick up on those wavelengths and recognize a reward. The cistern that holds that water, the overlapping leaf bases that form that cup that hold the water, is an adaptation that has helped this group survive And it does help individuals survive, but it is not necessary. It is not essential. It's just an added plus. So here we have this species, the northern needleleaf, where it has somehow managed to get knocked upside down. Its cistern is completely empty of water, but it's still doing just fine. So it still has the three-dimensional leaf surfaces, the scaly leaf surfaces. The roots that it's using to hang on are also capable of maybe absorbing and hanging on to a little bit of rainwater. But you can see this individual has been upside down long enough that it has even sensed gravity and uprighted its flowering stalk, because an upright flowering stalk is what its pollinator is going to recognize. So it's growing in that direction to facilitate that. Bartram's air plant, our next species. This is the one that Simulata is supposed to look like. But I get Simulata, or Bartram's, I'm sorry, I get Bartram's air plant confused with the northern needleleaf. Remember the one with the red sea urchins? This one looks like that one to me because of these very, very narrow needle leaves. But this one doesn't turn red, and it's more consistently silver. The needles are more consistently silver, which is what distinguishes that one. Also, much larger flowers than the southern needleleaf. This one produces, if you had the two next to each other, you could see that the flower stalks, the flowers themselves, are larger in comparison. A very large, and this one's looking more like it's relative to pineapple, right? This looks like somebody lopped the top off of pineapple and stuck it up in a tree. You can see the familial resemblance of the bromeliads. This is the Cardinal Air Plant. It is huge. When it flowers, it's beautiful. And as a result, unfortunately, this one has been taken out of the wild, has been over-collected. And so not only is it facing the threat of the weevil hollowing it out and killing it, but it's also faced with being removed from wild areas and sold, sometimes to people who think that a plant's going to do just fine in my dark guest bathroom. And that would be the end of it. When this plant is flowering, you can see why people would want to steal it. It has very large branched flower stems that are flattened, and the individual, remember the tubular flowers of the simulans here, you can see the resemblance of another species where we have all these tubular purple flowers coming out of these red and yellow bracts. Very, very showy thing. This one's right here. I think this picture was taken in June. We went out and checked this plant. It's not flowering this year. It's taken a year off. A lot of energy goes into producing that size inflorescence and the resulting seeds. So this is a plant that produces seeds when it feels like it, as opposed to the giant air plant, another biggie, another one of our, in fact, our largest epiphytic bromeliad that you'll find growing in the treetops around here. This one will grow for years and years and years without ever flowering. It'll get to be as many years as it wants to get, and as soon as it reaches a critical density, a critical mass, it produces this enormous flower spike, up to 2 meters tall, up to, not always, but it can be as big as 2 meters tall. Hundreds and hundreds of flowers, each flower developing into one of those seed pods that will release, 50 individual seeds on their parachutes. And then naturally the whole plant dies. So it's like one of those century plants, they grow for years and years and years and years and then flower, and then that's it. That condition is called monocarpy. And this is our only monocarpic species of bromeliad, if that's important to you. But again, this is a plant that might be taken out of the wild, sold, an unsuspecting person buys this thing because it's pretty and it takes care of itself and it's an air plant. I don't have to water it and this and that and the other thing. And finally it flowers, then the whole thing is dead. Money well spent? Dunno. It can look like the Cardinal Air Plant, and that's another threat to this species because collectors might not be able to distinguish between the Cardinal Air Plant that flowers every year and has, or flowers when it feels like it and doesn't die, but has those red and yellow flower spikes, versus this one that flowers and dies. So this species might be taken from the wild mistakenly. So we've got the Weevil, we've got the illegal collection, and then we have just being mistaken for something that we're not. So the giant air plant also has a lot of strikes against it. Information about these native bromeliads can be found in, and I believe this is the only currently available to the public treatise on this group of plants, this group of flowering plants, the bromeliads, native to Florida. And this is produced out of the Marie Selby Botanic Garden, where they have a collection of epiphytic plants. If you ever really want to dive deep into epiphytes, Marie Selby Botanic Garden is the place to go. They have actually a greenhouse that is nothing but epiphytic plants. Everything from orchids to epiphytic azaleas. Yes, rhododendrons that have found an epiphytic lifestyle. So a fascinating place to go. They do the research on the epiphytes, and this book is part of that came out of their research. Those are the biggies, the orchids and the bromeliads, but let's look at some other epiphytes. We have a few epiphytic ferns. Now, ferns have been around on Earth for a lot longer than the flowering plants. Way before there were any animals, well before there were any insects, no pollination, no nothing. Just the ferns and the mosses and nothing else. Nothing to keep it company, no bugs, no dinosaurs, none of that stuff. But once there were surfaces to grow on, once those other organisms came around and stood still long enough, the ferns were ready. They were in existence. They were reproducing. They were speciating. They were adapting and evolving. And so the ferns were ready to take on an epiphytic lifestyle. One of those species is the resurrection fern. And you might have heard of the resurrection fern. It does a magic trick. Here we have it looking like a typical fern, only growing on the trunk of a tree. Water, again, being a very limited resource when your roots aren't in the soil and they're instead being used to hang tight to a tree branch. So when water is not plentiful, these things just dry up. They just lose all their stored up water, and they turn inside out. So the underside of the fronds are exposed to the air, and that's where all the little holes are that leak water. And it's often kind of confusing that, why would these ferns collapse in such a way that would only make them dry out even faster? What's most important is that when the rain does come, they're going to absorb the water through this surface much more quickly and more efficiently. So it's not turning inside out to dry out faster, although they do. They turn inside out to rehydrate faster because that is more important. Also important, this inside out arrangement then exposes the spore producing tissue to the air. So again, there were no insects to take spores around. There were no insects to do anything for any plants. Everything was up to the wind and the environment. So turning inside out allows the spore producing surface of these ferns to be exposed to the air and allow the spores to drift off and land in a neighboring branch. Another one of our epiphytic ferns is the unfortunately named golden foot polypotie, Flabodium. Flabodium, I just think it's an ugly word, but it shares a root with your phlebotomist, the person who takes the blood out of your veins. So this is a very veiny fern. This is a golden veiny fern. Maybe that would be a better name. Anyway, a very neat arrangement of the spore producing structures along the underside of the leaf here. Leaves are much bigger. These don't have the ability to curl up and disappear like the resurrection fern. They just have to tough it out. So their little leaf stems here are very, very stiff. Their leaves themselves, the fronds, are very, very thick and leathery. They just have to kind of withstand the drought. They get their name golden foot. The growing stem kind of snakes in between the cracks and crevices of the tree bark that they're living on. Their auxiliary roots are going to branch out and hang on to that bark really tight. And the stems and the developing leaves are covered in these golden scales. And you might have heard of the rabbit's foot fern. Same idea. The little growing stem tips are the feet. And in this case, they're covered in the golden scales. And so they have these golden feet, and it's called the golden foot Polypotie. You'll see this one very often growing in the boots, in the crown of a cabbage palm, or many of our non-native landscape palms. This is a species that evolved and adapted and is quite happy to live in the crown of our native cabbage palm trees. That's where it likes to epiphyte. This individual, however, has found its way and is growing quite happily on an oak tree. Another epiphytic fern, the shoestring fern, couldn't look any less like a fern. But if you were to examine these long, narrow leaves, again, adaptation to living where water is an extremely limiting factor. We have a very low surface area here. But if we were to look at the underside of this leaf, we would find that spore-producing structures, the spore-producing tissue, exactly like other ferns. And that's what makes this fern a fern, the way that it reproduces. And it also loves and is adapted to living in the crown, in the boots, the leaf bases of our native and introduced palms. We'll look at some lichen, other epiphytes. Again, you can see a lichen here in the picture behind me. This one's growing on the bark of this viburnum alongside of the ghost orchid here with its tiny little mosquito pollinated flowers. So even though there's competition for space on the forest floor, with all the adaptations to living epiphytically, even tree branches, the smallest tree branches, they become contested territory. So it's a jungle. It's a lot of competition out there. Competition for space, competition for resources, competition for light, for water, for all the resources. And all these adaptations have allowed these species to survive and compete as best they can in the tree branches. Lichen deserve and have a presentation all to themselves. A fascinating group of organisms with an extremely long history. They're not one thing. They don't even belong to one kingdom of life. They represent a cooperative association of fungus and bacteria and algae and yeast and all these things all mixed up in different quantities and configurations and species of algae and species of fungus and blah, 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 all the variation. But they have three basic ways of existing as epiphytes. They might be crustose type lichens. They might be crustose epiphytic lichen species, where they're like paint on the bark of a tree. An example of a crustose lichen is one that catches a lot of people's attention up here at Brooker. It's called Baton Rouge. Very few organisms can produce a pink spot of paint in the middle of a swamp. Thus, the eye-catching ability of the Baton Rouge or the Christmas lichen. Another growth form exhibited by a completely different species of lichen is a foliose growth form, where it grows more like leaves, kind of up and off the surface of the bark where it's taken hold. A foliose growth habit is here demonstrated by a genus Parmelia, one of the shield lichens. Another epiphytic growth habit is a fruiticose growth habit, here demonstrated by a lichen called Usnea. Now remember Tillandsia usneoides, the Spanish moss? Maybe not, but I said it. Tillandsia usneoides, Spanish moss. Usnea means beard. And here it is, the same word is used for a completely different organism, this lichen organism, because it grows on tree branches and it looks like little gray beards hanging from the branches. Again, not doing any damage whatsoever to the tree where it's living, because it depends on the tree where it's living to be healthy and to live for a long time. So it's not doing any harm whatsoever to the tree that it's living on. And finally, we have a very attractive, almost comical little fruiticose lichen called British soldiers. They have these little red hats, these little red caps. They're also called matchsticks. They have kind of upright, cylindrical bodies that are capped with these little red warts. I don't know, arguably extremely cute. They are one of the Cladonia lichens. And again, as I promised, we're going to get a little off the wall, a little esoteric. There is a group of plants that predates all others, that represent the very, very, very first plants to have figured out how to live on land, out of the water, not being buoyed up by water, not being able to absorb water whenever they feel like it. This group of plants are called the mosses, the true mosses. That Spanish moss, remember, isn't Spanish, isn't moss, it's a flowering plant. The real mosses are those tiny, tiny, tiny little velvety carpet on the forest floor. They don't have leaves, they have these weird scales. They don't have seeds, they reproduce again by spores. They grow really low because they don't have any vasculars. They need to just be washed over by rain. Here we have several different species of moss. This one, the most predominant through here. And then we have the one with the silver knot leaves here. So a couple of different species. Mosses are another group of plants that deserve their own episode. But just as because mosses were the first on land, they were the first to figure everything out. And so the mosses are another group of plants that were already pre-evolved to be able to take advantage of life in the treetops. They already had wind-dispersed spores. They already had the ability to not dry out. So the mosses as a group are also very pre-adapted to life in the treetops. Moving up just a scooch, in the timeline of the evolution of plants on Earth, we have another strange group, non-flowering plants, reproduced by spores, no vascular tissue. They're not ferns, they're called liverworts. Not a very pretty name. But again, pre-adapted to extremely dry, extremely exposed, because they were the first on land. They didn't have anything to hide under. They didn't have any soil to root into, because there was no soil. There was just rock, there was just surface, and the liverworts were there. and they are pre-evolved to attach themselves, or their spores can attach themselves to a surface, germinate and grow into this new plant, which then can snake along and make leaves and eventually make spores to reproduce. And all the way back in time, before there was anything else, there was algae. And again, a few species managed to drift up onto the land and not die. And we have remnants of those very early evolving plants today, free living algae in the environment, not living in the water, not causing any horrible fish kills or anything like that. Here is an epiphytically living, free living algae species called Trentopolia. It looks kind of like rust. If trees could rust, which they can't, this is what it would look like. Colonies of this terrestrial or epiphytic algae growing free, epiphytically, again, pre-evolved to withstand desiccation, exposure, and having figured out a way to reproduce under those circumstances. We have species like this Trentopolia species around today. I better stop because we're getting really kind of off the rails. And I'm beginning to lose my ability to speak. Lucky you. We've been at this for an hour. Let's just wrap up with what we've learned today, shall we? Epiphytes aren't related to each other. Epiphytes come from all different groups of plants. We have flowering plants, we have ferns, we have mosses and liverworts and all these weird things, but they have a common lifestyle. They live on the branches, they live on the persistent structures, which historically, before people started building things, those persistent structures were trees. They do not harm their host. No epiphyte has it within their interest to harm because they depend on that host being as healthy as possible to live as long as it can. They come from all across the board, and just think of the contributions of all these epiphytic organisms to the overall health of the ecosystem. They're all plants, they're all photosynthesizing. The byproduct of photosynthesis, oxygen, right? They all provide, in some form or another, some sort of food for the next tier in the food web. So we beg you, don't fall victim to the person who promises to relieve you of all those pesky Spanish mosses. You're looking at the wrong problem. There's something wrong with that host tree, and the epiphytes would love it if you fixed the problem and didn't just rip them out. Now, being kind does tend to have its limits. Don't go nuts. Don't go and pick up every fallen Spanish moss and save it. You'll go mad. Also, if you do find epiphytes that may have fallen to the ground, they're not going to make it. It's just the way it's going to be. Don't bring them home because they might have one of those dang weevils in them, and we don't want to accidentally move that around where it doesn't need to be. Does that make sense? Plus, if you pick an epiphyte up off the ground in a place where you don't have a sphere of influence, it's not yours. So it needs to stay right where it is, okay? For the last time, do not treat Spanish moss or lichen or real moss. There's no need. They're not harming anything. And what the ultimate thing you can do for epiphytes, the ultimate thing, the ultimate way that you can help are native epiphytes. Plant a tree. And plant a tree that's going to live for a very long time. Remember, our epiphytes don't harm the host. They want the host to live as long as it possibly can. So a nice long-lived oak tree like a live oak will be the best thing you can do to help our native epiphytes. So thank you very, very much for joining us today. As I promised, we will go and talk all about orchids in a few weeks' time on August 11th, right here, same way to sign up, and we'll dig deep. I mentioned that we only have a couple of epiphytic orchid species, and we mentioned them today. We'll look at the rest. We have about 20 different orchids here, native or naturalized in Pinellas County, and we'll look at those on Wednesday, August the 11th. Thanks for your attention. We have a couple of questions. If you have any questions, and if you don't have to skip off right away, go ahead and put them in the Q&A. There's a little Q&A. It looks like a speech bubble. You can put your comments, questions in the Q&A, and we'll answer them now. We do have a couple lined up. Regina would like to know if you can or should put store-bought orchids in a tree. I've heard they rebloom in a pot occasionally, but not usually. Well, the question is about putting some store-bought orchids into a tree so they can live their life as an epiphyte. And it depends on the type of orchid. So it really does, some would do quite well. Some you would want to keep in a pot because they're going to do better in a pot, especially during those very rare but serious cold snaps. Once a plant starts growing epiphytically on a tree, you can't bring it inside for the winter. If you break those roots, if you rip that thing off of its tree, it's going to do more damage than good. But there are some species of store-bought orchids that would be suited. That's a great question to turn to our horticulture helpline at your extension services. It can be a good idea. It can be ill-advised. So get a great photograph of the species in particular, if you're thinking of one in particular, and put that question to your local extension office. Question, and thank you for that question. Rita would like to know if resurrection fern will grow on any tree. And that's an excellent question, and something that we didn't quite touch on. Are some trees better hosts than others? And just like with our orchid question that we had before, it depends on the epiphyte. Some epiphytes are probably best suited for life in trees with very, very deeply grooved bark. And not all trees have that. Some trees have very smooth bark that might be hard to get a toehold on. So it can depend on the species. It can depend on a lot of things, but resurrection fern in general is not fussy about where it grows. And that is evidenced by the fact that you can find resurrection fern growing on roofs, on benches. You can find it often, not often, but occasionally growing on plastic surfaces. So it doesn't have, it's not bound to any particular tree species. Now, what I don't know and what warrants some research is, are there species of trees that might have chemical or physical characteristics that prevent epiphytes from taking hold? You don't often see epiphytes in pine trees. And of course, pines make quite a lot of chemicals like esters and terpenes, turpentine, but pines also have bark that flakes off. Very hard to get to get a toehold on a shifting surface. So as the pine sheds these plates and plaques and sheets of bark, they're going to lose their epiphytic load. So number one, the epiphytes might not germinate because of the terpenes, and number two, they might not stick around long because of the fact that the pine is continually sloughing off bark. We have, what about mold? Mold as an epiphyte, that's a really good, perhaps we should add, should we add? No, let's not, we can't. Okay, mold sorry, had to spin that through the Rolodex a little bit. Mold represents an organism that belongs in the fungal kingdom. And the fungus, it's not a plant, it's not an animal. The fungus grows in the host. It grows in the environment that it eats. So soil-borne fungus, molds that live in the soil, they grow through the soil and they secrete the enzymes that dissolve whatever's in the soil that they need to reabsorb. So if you have a mold growing, a true fungus, growing in the bark of your tree, it's not growing epiphytically. It's growing endophytically. It's growing inside the tissues and it's dissolving those tissues as it grows through. So as far as what about mold, it's not an epiphyte. It has a completely different way of living in and through the host. Okay, great. Thank you very much for your questions today. I really appreciate your attention. We hope you'll join us again on August 11th for Orchids. Again, any questions, comments, complaints, concerns, you can always drop me a line at the email address down below, and we hope to see you August 11th. Thank you so much for joining us, and goodbye.